හරිම සුමුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Thursday, the 26th of October 2023. Unveiling shortly, President teases reinvigorated economic dissemination plan at the upcoming Budget 2024. Stay the course. Nepal MP and economist stresses that the IMF deployed economic best practices are paramount for the country's re-emergence into relevance. Boots on ground. Israeli Prime Minister signals ground offensive as Israel's war on Hamas escalates.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟමැති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and a warm welcome to today's edition of AdaDerana's English News First at 9. I'm Jonathan Benedict. Let's get into our news stories for the day right now. A reinvigorated economic vision. When and where? President Ranil Wickremesinghe confirms that the upcoming budget speech scheduled for next month will contain the dissemination plan in full. Addressing the National ICT Awards NBQSA 2023 held in Colombo yesterday, President Wickremesinghe said that measures should be taken to raise funds and attract more foreign investors into the country in order to facilitate developing IT infrastructure, whilst also looking at alternative export markets to increase foreign exchange earnings. Simultaneously, President Wickremesinghe said that the government plans to introduce new legislation to facilitate Sri Lanka's transformation to a green and digital economy.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe attended the National ICT Awards NBQSA 2023 held in Colombo yesterday, organised by the British Computer Society and the Chartered Institute for IT, Sri Lanka section.
With the collapse of the economy and the bankruptcy, one factor has hit the country hard. If we are to go forward, we must ensure the balance of trade is in our favour, that we have a surplus in our exports. We can't just depend on apparels and tea. We have to look into new areas. But more than that, what we are looking at the structure of a new economy. If you want it to be a modern economy, you want it to have a trade surplus for Sri Lanka, then firstly, it must be a highly competitive economy able to compete in any other part of the world and able to compete also with the imports that come in. This is what I call a highly competitive economy. You have to compete and win. If you are having a highly competitive and a modern economy, there are two other factors which I have outlined. One is the green economy. We do have renewable energy and a capacity for green economy. The world is undergoing a green transformation. There is no reason why we shouldn't. And then your digital economy, or the digital transformation. During the budget speech next month, I will also outline the start of the new economy. We'll also bring in laws which point in that direction. But this time we will go one step ahead. Pass laws that will promote competitiveness, green transformation and digital transformation. It is easier said than done. Laws alone are not sufficient. We have to look at the digital infrastructure. Who's going to do it? Certainly not the government. Government hasn't got the money even if they want to do it. Second part is the human capital. We need more. We need at postgraduate level, at graduate level, at diploma level and at skills level. That also has to be taken over by the private sector and the government. The rest is the roadmap which has been prepared. And one of funding. We'll have to raise our own funds or we'll also have to invite foreign investment. There's no way out. If you are going to expand rapidly, this is what you need. Sri Lanka will be next to India. That's an industry that is growing, is multiplying in India. So we have to learn, be next to India. That is one. We must be a unique platform for this purpose. Let's look at where our strengths are and let's see how we can promote it further.
A statement issued by the President's Media Division said that Sri Lanka is scheduled to enter its 12th round of negotiations for a proposed economic and technology cooperation agreement with India. According to the statement, the comprehensive agreement has a broader scope than the current India-Sri Lanka trade-free India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, underscoring the deepening economic ties between the two nations. Sri Lanka is also negotiating with other ASEAN countries, including China, Thailand and Indonesia, with the goal of expanding trade cooperation across various sectors. The President's Media Division in a statement said that in a strategic move to reboot Sri Lanka's domestic economy, the government is placing strong emphasis on expanding supply capacity and broadening market access with the aim to propel the nation towards economic recovery. These comprehensive trade initiatives are integral to Sri Lanka's vision of transforming it into a developed economy by 2048. Sri Lanka is scheduled to enter its 12th round of negotiations on the proposed economic and technology cooperation agreement with India, predicated on the aim of deepening economic ties between the two nations through the current free trade agreement between the two nations. Sri Lanka is also in discussions with China to resume negotiations for a proposed free trade agreement, and so far 6 rounds of negotiations have been concluded. The agreement aims to gain market access for selected Sri Lankan products in China and establish links to global value chains. The country is also actively engaged in discussions with Bangladesh on the preferential trade agreement. The success of the agreement is seen as a pivotal move to further enhance bilateral trade beyond the existing agreements in place. Sri Lanka's agreement with ASEAN countries is on the rise through free trade agreements. Currently, Sri Lanka has bilateral trade agreements in place with India, Pakistan and Singapore, and have regional trade agreements with the South Asian Free Trade Area and the SAARC Preferential Trading Arrangement. Ongoing negotiations are taking place with Thailand and Indonesia. Additionally, Sri Lanka is determined to establish an economic integration program with ASEAN, Oceania and East Asia by joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which the government has already submitted its letter of intention to join. In other news, member of Nepal's Federal Parliament and economist Dr. Swarnim Wagle is of the view that Sri Lanka has to fulfill its promises made to the International Monetary Fund under the Extended Funding Facility program to come out of the crisis. He added that it provides a clear sign for potential investors that Sri Lanka is deeply considering the implementation of crisis measures to bounce back. Speaking to Indivari Amawata during our current affairs program at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 during his visit to Sri Lanka, Dr. Wagle commended Sri Lanka's measures to bilaterally engage with countries outside the South Asian region to gain preferential trade access, which will be advantageous for Sri Lanka's export products.
Do you think Sri Lanka is actually using this crisis to bounce back or to have a longer-term sustainable growth in terms of the policies and the reforms that we are undertaking? Are we on track?
Not to the extent that was initially conceived. The IMF has come up with a $3 billion extended fund facility, EFF, and that comes with a series of conditions, especially on the consolidation of your public finance, right? So the revenue or the tax to GDP ratio is fairly low in Sri Lanka. So there are lots of tax exemptions and collection is not strong enough. The enforcement of many legislative measures is not strong. On average, you are at less than 10% of GDP. Even my country, which is much poorer than Sri Lanka, is at 20% of GDP, our tax collection, although it's fragile, it's all taxing imports and all that. Nonetheless, I think Sri Lanka could do a lot more in consolidating its fiscal house. The way debt structuring is proceeding, I think there's some improvements to be had. But in its entirety, if you step back and take a bigger picture, it becomes a governance story. And this is where the IMF's governance diagnostic study is exceptionally important, right? They're very candid. They talk about corruption, vulnerabilities, and all the other blind spots in the governance of this country. And that ought to be tackled head on.
This IMF program is not very popular in Sri Lanka because it's at times a political slogan, at times a reason for unexplainable conditions imposed on Sri Lanka.
The leadership has to do a better job in explaining the circumstances. You didn't need to go to the IMF, right? But you had to go to the IMF because there's nobody else coming and rescuing you. And when you go to the IMF, most countries, not just Sri Lanka, you're already in a deep economic trouble. So the IMF gets blamed for a lot of the mess that the politicians created. And they are asked at the very end when the plot has thickened and things are in a real mess. Sometimes this ultra-nationalism often gets in the way and it's at the detriment of the country. Maybe these guys have their interests safeguarded and IMF becomes a convenient punching bag. But right now, for example, without the $3 billion coming from the IMF, and they wouldn't just give it to you to again continue the perverse subsidies, just pay back loans indiscriminately, and all that, because that's also somebody else's money. So, and they have to put conditions, and their conditions are necessary often for the country. Now, one could quibble with the sequencing of it, what comes before, what comes next, does it need to be this harsh early on? Those can be debated, and this is what the function of the professionals in the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury or the Central Bank, this is what they do. But once you sign and seal the deal, it's very important to follow through. Otherwise, that sends a signal that this is not a serious country, that it reneges on its promises.
You mentioned that Sri Lanka adopted reforms early on, but did not see the results that we would have or we should have anticipated. Again, was it the handouts or the wrong and mismanagement of public finances or wrong policies that led Sri Lanka into this, in your understanding?
If you go back to 77, the early reforms, the trade liberalization, even India hadn't liberalized by then. India was forced to liberalize in 91. Now looking back, of course, some of those liberal measures also have to be nuanced and understood slightly differently. But the problem with Sri Lanka, you mentioned that this is the 17th time that Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF. You see, if you look at the previous packages, it turns out programs would proceed and then they would be halted, they would be stalled and not carried through. When it came to a point when the unpopular measures had to be implemented. So if you do an assessment, objective assessment of many of the previous packages, things have not been complete at all. So that's a problem.
Sri Lanka is looking at enhanced FTAs with countries. Where negotiating a Thailand FTA and also the comprehensive agreements to the Indo-Lanka agreement, and even with China. With all that, Sri Lanka is also aspiring to be a hub status for the region.
Sri Lanka engaging bilaterally outside of South Asia is also a positive thing for Sri Lanka. It opens big markets for your products. So if you have a preferential market access to Southeast Asian economies, Thailand is a pretty big economy, China is huge. That's a good opportunity for your products, not just for your tea and coconuts and rubber and garments, but even for IT products, right? A lot of digitalization is there. And to bring in tourists from those sort of growing middle income countries. But there's another aspect to this, that other investors seeking to enter the Chinese market could make Sri Lanka as the base, right? If you came here, located your industries here, let's say a Polish firm, or an Argentinian firm or a factory would be located here, they would need to add degree of value here. So that could be Sri Lankan labor force getting employment. Then it becomes a made in Sri Lanka product, even irrespective of the investor, and gaining preferential market access to these large markets. Many countries have done that. I am happy that Sri Lanka is looking at countries which are comparable in per capita income, like Vietnam, let's say, but also slightly higher, not radically higher, so that the degree of asymmetry is lessened.
South Korean naval vessel Kwanggaeto the Great arrived in Colombo today for a 3-day visit. The 135-meter naval vessel, which belongs to the destroyer class, docked at the Colombo port with 249 crew members aboard. Addressing the media during an event to welcome the South Korean vessel, Minister of Ports, Shipping and Aviation Nimal Siripala de Silva said that the arrival of large vessels of this nature provides an assurance to the international community on the standards that are put in place at the Colombo port to provide a high quality of service.
South Korea's naval vessel ROK's Kwanggaeto the Great arrived at the port of Colombo this morning on a formal visit with 249 crew members. The visiting ship was welcomed by the Sri Lanka Navy in accordance with naval traditions.
저희가 우리 교민 대표님.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for coming here.
ROK's Kwanggaeto the Great is a 135-meter long destroyer which was named after Korean Empire Kwanggaeto the Great. During the ship's stay in Colombo, the crew will visit some of the tourist attractions of Sri Lanka. The ship is scheduled to depart the island on the 28th of October.
අපේ වරාය මෙවැනි විශාල නෞකාවන් සඳහා අවශ්‍ය සේවාව ලබා දීම සඳහා අපි සකස් කරලා තියෙන්නේ. විශේෂයෙන්ම මෙවැනි නෞකාවන් පැමිණීම සමගම මේ රට පිළිබඳව විශාල විශ්වාසයක් ජාත්‍යන්තර වශයෙන් ලැබෙනවා. අපේ වරායේ තියෙන ගුණාත්මක භාවයට ලැබෙන තවත් සහතිකයක් තමයි මෙවැනි විශාල නෞකා පැමිණීම. ඒ තුලින් අපිට යම් ආදායම් මාර්ගات පුදවා ගන්නට පුළුවන්.
Our Kwanggaeto the Great ship, Navy ship, and the Cheonghae unit has come to visit the Colombo port the first time in 6 years. They have just completed their mission in the Gulf of Oman and Aden on the international missions to counter terrorism and also secure maritime safety. On their way back, I was very much happy for them to come to the port of Colombo to experience and best use of the high quality port services here, and also take use of the strategic locations and the hospitality. I hope this is not going to be the first time, but become a regular and frequent visit, And also, we would like to work very closely with Sri Lanka to expand cooperations and engagements under the umbrella of our Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy.
The conflict between Israel and Hamas have claimed the lives of over 8,000 people, which includes 6,000 Palestinians. Israeli troops carried out a targeted raid with tanks in northern Gaza today before withdrawing from the enclave as part of a ground offensive, as intimated by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Defense Forces said that the raid was part of preparations for the next stages of combat.
At least 6,546 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, including 2,704 children, as Israel continues their strikes across besieged Gaza on the 20th day of the conflict. During the past 24 hours, Israel strikes over 250 Hamas terror targets, including terror infrastructure, operational command centers, tunnel shafts, and rocket launchers were placed in the heart of civilian areas that fired towards Israel territory throughout the war. Meanwhile, the Israel Defense Forces confirmed that it carried out an airstrike targeting Hamas terrorist infrastructure in an area of Gaza where 12 members of an Al Jazeera journalist family were killed yesterday, where relatives of Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief Wael Al-Dahdu were taken shelter after being replaced. Al-Dahdu's wife, son, daughter and grandson were amongst those killed. Further, Israel troops carried out a targeted raid with tanks in northern Gaza today before withdrawing from the enclave. The IDF said that raid was part of preparations for the next stages of combat. IDF spokesperson Peter Lerner described the raid as large but limited in scope, saying it was a clear and sweep operation intended to create better terms for ground operations if and when that comes in. Meanwhile, the US and Russia both failed to pass resolutions on the Gaza conflict at the United Nations Security Council yesterday. Russia and China vetoed the US draft resolution on the Middle East, while Russia's draft resolution did not get enough votes to be adopted. It failed to require the 9 votes needed for consideration. The result for the US resolution was announced as 10 votes in favor, 3 against veto, and 2 abstentions. The US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said she was deeply disappointed by the veto.
Welcome back. The Sri Lankan government has renewed the petroleum products license granted to Lanka IOC, the local subsidiary of Indian Oil Corporation. The Sri Lankan wing of the Indian multinational oil and gas company is thus allowed to continue its retail operations on the island for another 20 years, with effect from January 22nd of 2024. This was communicated by Lanka IOC PLC's Managing Director Deepak Das in a letter addressed to the Chief Regulatory Officer of the Colombo Stock Exchange. The announcement was made pursuant to Section 8 of the Listings Rule of CSE. Moving on to stocks news, the Colombo Stock Exchange launched the regulated short selling through stock borrowing and lending effective from 6th November 2023. The initiative aims to promote market efficiency, liquidity and investor confidence while fostering economic growth, aligning with international standards and practices. SBL, an initiative by the CSE, connects lenders and borrowers of shares for a predetermined period, allowing them to capitalize on market trends such as prevailing interest rates. Only eligible securities specified by the CSE will be allowed for SBL transactions, and the eligibility of these securities will be reviewed by the CSE on a quarterly basis. All investors who maintain central depository system accounts will have the privilege of engaging in SBL transactions as lenders and borrowers via the CDS through their respective trading participants and custodian banks. Investors can carry out SBL transactions by submitting the lending or borrowing orders using the participant pool account or by submitting orders directly to the CDS through their participants. In other news, Sri Lanka Customs have confirmed that in the past 7 years, the Customs Service has recorded a revenue of 742 billion rupees. Director of Customs Sivali Arukkagoda says that customs income dropped in the past 4 years due to the series of events in Sri Lanka that began with the tragic 2019 Easter Sunday attack. He further proceeded to provide an update on customs revenue details when queried by AdaDerana.
ඒගෝ විසින් 2017 සිට අද වෙන විට බිලියන 742ක් එකතු කරලා තියෙනවා. 2018 වසර තමයි අපි වැඩිම ආදායමක් එකතු කරලා තියෙන්නේ බිලියන 920ට පසු වෙන වසරවලදී ඔබේනවා ආදායම අඩු වෙලා තියෙනවා කියලා හේතු කිහිපයක් ඔබ දන්නවා 2019 පාස්කු ප්‍රහාරයෙන් පස්සේ සංචාරකයන් පැමිණීම අඩු වුණා. ඔවුන් වෙනුවෙන් ආනයන කරන භාණ්ඩවල ප්‍රමාණය අඩු වුණා. ඊට පස්සේ 2020 කොවිඩ් ප්‍රශ්නය අපිට ආවා. අදාළ ප්‍රමාණයන් ආනයන කිරීම අඩු වුණා. ඊට පස්සේ 21 සහ 22 වසරවලදී රටේ පැවතුණු ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්න නිසා ආනයනය සීමා කිරීම නිසා තමයි මේ බදු ආදායම පහළ ගිහිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ. රත්රන් නීති විරෝධීව ලංකාවට ගෙනීමට තැත් කිරීම අවස්ථා 90ක් රේගු නිලධාරීන් අදාළ පුද්ගලයන් සහ භාණ්ඩ අත්අඩංගුවට අරගෙන තියෙනවා. රත්තරන් වල බර කිලෝග්‍රෑම් 115ක් මෙහි වටිනාකම මිලියන 925ක් පමණ වෙනවා. රටතුරට නීති විරෝධීව ගෙනෙන්නට තරල විෂ මද්‍රව්‍ය කිලෝග්‍රෑම් 95 එවැනිට අත්අඩංගුවට අරගෙන තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේ වටිනාකම මිලියන 981ක් පමණ වෙනවා දල වශයෙන්.
The Colombo Stock Exchange closed lower today with the index being dragged down by the banking and capital goods sectors. The CSE All-Share Index closed 0.74% lower at 10,536.33 points. The index touched its lowest at 10,530.41 points during midday trade before picking up by the end of the day's trading. Meanwhile, the S&P SL20 was up 0.85% at 2,952.22 points. At National Bank, Richard Pearce and Company and Commercial Bank of Ceylon were the top losers on the index, down 2.44%, 2.9% and 0.84% respectively. Trading volume on the index rose to 30.3 million shares from 56.9 million shares in the previous session. Equity market turnover fell to 891.3 million rupees from 920.3 billion rupees in the previous session. The diversified financial sector was the top contributor to market turnover today, while the capital goods sector was the second highest contributor. Foreign investors were net buyers, purchasing stocks worth 135.2 million rupees, while domestic investors were net sellers, offloading shares worth 840 million rupees. Now it's time to take a look at how the rupee traded against other major currencies as the day progressed. The central depository system of the Colombo Stock Exchange has signed an agreement with Lanka Pay, joining its online payment platform to facilitate online payments for investors. Meanwhile, CG Capital Partners Global has completed the acquisition of Culture Finance Holdings. With that, let's take a look at the corporate sector news for the day. The Central Depository System, a fully owned subsidiary of the Colombo Stock Exchange, recently signed an agreement with Lanka Pay, Sri Lanka's national payment network, joining its online payment platform to facilitate a seamless and secure payment experience for investors. The new payment platform aims to transform how investors participate in initial public offerings, rights issues and other offers. The new CDS payment service is an electronic IPO and e-rights payment service enabled via the CSE mobile app and CDS web portal. This partnership with Lanka Pay enables investors the ease of investing in IPOs and rights issues up to a transaction value of 10 million rupees, as approved by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka online real-time basis. Union Bank says that the directors of Union Bank received formal notification that the transaction to the proposed acquisition of Cultural Financial Holdings Limited, a substantial shareholder of shares in Union Bank by CG Capital Partners Global, has been completed. Through its ownership in Cultural Financial Holdings, CG Capital Partners are now the main shareholder of Union Bank. Newly incorporated subsidiary company of Bairaha Farms PLC, Global Reach Foods Private Limited, said that it has purchased land and a building located in Pannala in the Kurunegala district for a total of 310 million rupees, including legal and stamp fees. The firm plans to initially engage in the production and export of certain niche meat-based products, with operations expected to commence on the 1st of November 2023. That's all the news I have for you for this evening. I'm Jonathan Benedict. Have a blessed Friday ahead. Good night.